Well, ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you. My name is James Rowlingleaf. I'm serving as a moderator. Let me begin by saying how midakiapi chante washted na pechu sapalo James Rowlingleaf imachapi na si chango lakoto oyate mata. Welcome. I greet you with a handshake from my heart to you. And welcome to the GEO Indigenous Alliance towards a more inclusive humanitarian action webinar. And this is an effort, an event co-sponsored, co-led by the GEO Indigenous Alliance. And so with that, as an Indigenous organization, we always begin our events when we gather like this, whether it's in person or through this Zoom platform that we have to do today. We start these things, what we say, in a good way. We bring in our customs, we bring in our traditions, and we bring in our spirituality, so that the time we spent today is done in a good, respectful, honorable, and reciprocal way. So we're really happy today. I'm happy and honored to have one of my relatives, one of my relations from my tribe, the Rosebud Sioux tribe, one of our knowledge holders, one of our leaders, to give an opening blessing and prayer and comments. So we're happy to have Mr. Phil Tweagle to do that. Mr. Phil Tweagle, would you lead us off? Opila.
Oh, oh, mitakiapi, you are chante wastia na peo chief. Take your hand with a good heart. Greetings from the Chetty Shakoni territory, the land of the seven council fires. Coming to you from Rosebud, South Africa. Call ourselves the Sichangu Lakota Oyate. Background, you'll see the ancestral homelands of our people across the United States, diagonal with Canada to the Carolinas, original ancestral. Our people are buried there. Very honored to be able to bring you a prayer of unity for all of the indigenous people of the world, and to work on protecting Mother Earth. We call her Unchimaka. She is alive, and she is crying. And then we want to educate the world about traditional knowledge, about the connection to Mother Earth, that she has a spirit. And everything around us has a spirit, according to Lakota ways. I'm sure other indigenous ways of life, they also believe in the spirituality. And my prayers go to each and every one of your homes and to the lands that you live, so that you could live in a good way in protecting Mother Earth. O atewa kantaka leo petu ki fukia woshila chichila yo mitake o leo petu ki woyu kitanki chunki ultima ka a homini elo gana daku washte unkashi ki ultima ka zani kita chaha oyati ki ispahi tana chunki apu le temps à taku chipiki na hete okaja na oicha na nashi trumpishi hete trokata kia wichoicha ushu kilana okiapo ultima ka hete taku washunga chipiki oyate ki echa iwashke tiwahe na tiospaye na ospaye oyate ki zani Lelo gana hoyo ushi mokulayo ocheti shako I makoche owa itaku yasi.
Oh, Ostelo, Wopila Tunka Phil Tanji. Thank you again for that prayer, and again, thank you for leading us and helping us start this a good way, Phil. Wopila. At this time, I want to introduce Diana Mastrazzi, who's the communications consultant for the GEO Secretariat. And also she's the International Strategic Indigenous Liaison for the GEO Indigenous Alliance. So the floor is yours, Diana.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Phil to Ego. So today we want to use the momentum of this week-long event to develop a collective strategy that supports inclusive humanitarian action that takes into account Indigenous rights and worldviews. Indigenous people possess invaluable knowledge and expertise that is often overlooked when preparing for and responding to humanitarian action. In this Indigenous-led session, you will hear from Indigenous people from the Arctic all the way to the Amazon rainforest on how they're using Earth observation data, ranging from satellite imagery all the way to in situ weather data, to promote a more inclusive humanitarian action. Humanitarian action must reflect the complexity of Indigenous worldviews and their unique understandings of hazards, risks, and vulnerabilities. Earth observation data and tools developed with and for Indigenous communities can help us to do this. To address the most daunting challenges of our time, we must work together to ensure that the rights and needs of Indigenous people guide future humanitarian action. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Diana, for that introduction and for the context for our time. Again, a reminder to all our listeners and participants, please put your questions in a question answer part of Zoom and also in your comments in the chat. So we thank you. We welcome your questions. We look forward to your questions and your interest. At this time, I have the great pleasure of meeting a new friend of ours, new colleague of ours, Anders Oskal. Anders Oskal is a reindeer herding Sami from northern Norway. He is a Secretary General at the Association of World Reindeer Herders and Executive Director of the International Center for Reindeer Husbandry in Norway. He is also the Executive Committee member of the Arctic Economic Council. With that, Anders, welcome to the webinar, and the floor is yours.
Logituudam odejumi otas mun län Oskal unihantinger Marianta mun huiduhtavas kobasadas melde. Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. My name is Anders Oskal, and I'm very happy to be with you today. I wish to give you some insights into my world. And my world is the Arctic, the top of the globe, very cold, some would say desolate area. And this is the home of the reindeer, and this is the homelands of the reindeer herders. And I will speak a little bit about reindeer herding initially and about the changes under which we are subject now, and also our visions of new technologies and how they could be used for our benefit. This map has the North Pole in its center, and I am from Arctic Norway on the left part of the map. This map shows you the reindeer herding areas where our 24 nomadic indigenous peoples to this day are still following our reindeer, since like our ancestors have done since time immemorial. And so we are spread across 3 continents, 10 national states, but we are very united in our way of life, our understanding of the world, our understanding of nature, the holistic perspectives, which I know we share with a lot of the other participants here, our indigenous brothers and sisters. Now, of course, we are facing a time of great change in the Arctic. The Arctic is changing much faster than the rest of the world in terms of climate change. So to use our own knowledge base, our own traditional indigenous knowledge is for us central, like it always was. And just to say, one of the changes we see is that of changing snow conditions, which are very important for our reindeer to survive winter. And we have in our language terms for disastrous years, guavi or guavayaki, which is a year that is absolutely disastrous for our reindeer and thus also for reindeer herders. And so we have been attempting to use remote sensing technologies to better understand and predict these changes. For instance, in 2014 in Western Siberia, 70,000 reindeer perished during the winter. We just came out of last winter, a disastrous year for reindeer herding Sami. And what we see is that this type of extreme weather events, these guavi, seems to be increasing. So it's important for us to understand more of this. Then again, we have our indigenous knowledge, and reindeer herders know a lot about snow. So one of our reindeer herders did a PhD some years back called The Silent Language of Snow. She's a linguist, you see, and she studied the concepts in the language, the Sami language, one dialect spoken in the village where I live here, and discovered, of course, what we knew from before, that it's a deep and systematic knowledge about natural phenomena, snow physiology, snow metamorphosis, and so on. And she identified, as a pedagogical example, 318 terms for snow in just the dialect of Sami spoken in our village here. So this is a systematic knowledge base. It's more than just culture. This is the knowledge upon which our cultures, our ancestors have survived the most unhospitable environments on the planet. And we believe that this systematic knowledge also must be used in the management of a rapidly changing world and a rapidly changing Arctic. And it must be done also by the use of new technologies. Another area which is of great concern to us are fires. We've seen extreme Taiga and Tundra fires on our reindeer herding lands in Siberia, for instance, the results of which are no less dire for reindeer herders than, for instance, our brothers and sisters in the Amazon. And earlier fires in these regions in southeastern Siberia used to be, a few hundred. Now it's exploded to over 2,000 just the last 5 years. So this is really a hockey stick development and a matter of great concern. And again, we try to use remote sensing to help us grasp and understand what is happening, try to predict more, but also to try to let's say, forecast and understand how to handle this. Then again, as we speak about new technologies, our constituency are mainly nomadic people, still living, on the land like our ancestors always used to, following our reindeer, meaning that most of us live in tents, pretty far away from electricity grids and even cell phone coverage. This statistic is a bit old, but it shows you the cell phone coverage in the Arctic a few years back. And so this is challenging. Where we have intensive industrial development and so on, there we have, of course, cell phone coverage, otherwise not. So how can we then access this new technology? Well, as it turns out, already in it was 2000, we formed ourselves a vision that we want to have internet in every single nomadic tent, which at the time was laughed at. It was not feasible. It was not foreseeable. How could we even think of that? But as time is progressing, satellite and internet is becoming available. And so we like to see this and turn this around. New technology shouldn't only be a tool for everything that surrounds reindeer herders, like development industry, universities, national governments, and so on. It also needs to be a tool for our peoples. And so this decade, the next decade, is a decade of enormous technological developments. This can also be our decade when we think about the true potential here. And what is the potential? Well, one of the things that we've done during COVID is to train our youth. And we do so online, like we're on this Zoom call now. Just to show you, we had 30 Indigenous youth from all over the Arctic in a joint leadership training program with Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. And it works like a charm. So this is the true potential for our youth, our Indigenous youth living on the land with their animals, living in tents, to become, let's say, true citizens of not only their respective countries as such, but true citizens of the world in a time of great change. So to round off, I will say that I would just repeat what the IPCC fifth assessment concluded about the polar regions, because of all the big challenges that the polar regions are facing in terms of climate change, there was one answer that addressed all of these difficult factors, and that was to use science in combination with traditional Indigenous knowledge, and to frame that also by the use of new technology. So this is really exciting, I think, but we need to work together on making a path forward so that we can truly utilize these opportunities also for our peoples. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Anders, for that great presentation. We have a question for you here. The questioner says, thank you for the great opportunity to have this discussion. Question, how can we work to explain the shifting seasons and weather extremes in a way that helps people understand that the changes are serious? We have not been able to obtain the physical meteorological site observations despite years of lobbying for physical data collection, and it seems to be necessary for our observations to be seen as legitimate. As the changes continue, the land is emptying out. People are forced to move away as conditions worsens. So that's your question, Anders. Yeah,
you know, we get this question a lot. We worked with climate change adaptation since 1999, the Association of World Reindeer Herders, that is. Reindeer herders are not climate skeptics. Indeed, we can see that something is out of the ordinary. And how can we be so sure when we know that our climate in the north, in Sami language, mind you, we don't even have a word for stability because our world is unstable. That's a given. So how can we be so sure that we're not inside the natural variability? Well, one example that I used to take is that of the reindeer. Our reindeer knows where to go. Our reindeer pick themselves the path. We follow them. They don't follow us. And for that reason, you know, a lot of families have had migration routes. You could think of this map behind me from this picture behind me. Migration routes that would go through these mountains here and so on and so forth, that the reindeer themselves have picked. And because these migration routes have been used for centuries by the same families, we also know something is really out of the ordinary when the reindeer now refuse to go there. Why? Because of shrub growth. And greening of the Arctic is something that's easily detectable by remote sensing. And in the case of reindeer herding, I would suggest we could use that as an example. Lots of research being done on this as we speak. Sorry, that was a bit long, but thank you for the question.
Thank you, Anders, for your presentation, and we welcome you to be part of the GEO Indigenous Alliance community. And I love the internet in every tent vision.
Yes.
Thank you, Anders.
Thank you so much.
Our next presenter again is Anita Lucchesi. Anita is a researcher and scholar of Cheyenne and Italian descent. She is the founding executive director of Sovereign Bodies Institute. Anita is also a PhD student at the University of Arizona. Her areas of specialty include violence against Indigenous peoples, femicide, gender and sexual violence, Indigenous cartography and geography, Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous research methodologies. We welcome Anita, and the floor is yours, Anita. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to share in this space today. It's really an honor and a privilege, and I'm really humbled to meet so many amazing Indigenous people in this circle who are doing such incredible work for our peoples and our relatives. I'm going to share my screen so you can see some slides. Today, I'm going to be talking about efforts to address missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of Two-Spirit, there's lots of different definitions of it out there, and all of them are valid. But today, I'm using it to refer to our relatives who may identify as LGBTQ and anywhere on that spectrum. So today we're going to be talking about efforts to address missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, specifically how SBI is working to address the issue by uplifting Indigenous survivors and impacted families to be experts in the research process. And just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, I'm briefly going to share a little bit about my own story, why I think maps and research are so important and can be so empowering in this kind of work. And then we'll talk a little bit about Sovereign Bodies Institute and how we do things, and end with a brief discussion of what I think the future looks like in this work. So I am a survivor of domestic violence, rape, and trafficking. This picture of me on this slide was taken while I was being trafficked. And the reason that I share it is because I think there's a lot of stereotypes out there of what a trafficking victim looks like and what their story is. And I really want to dispel some of those myths. I don't meet any kind of stereotype you could imagine. I know there's a lot of stories out there of vans in Walmart parking lots, or people growing up in really abusive homes. And I'm not saying those things don't happen, because I believe they do, but that wasn't my story. I come from a good family. My family did not have substance use or violence in my home. And I didn't experience violence until I became an adult. I was not picked up out of a Walmart parking lot. I was trafficked by an intimate partner. The majority of people who are trafficked, both Indigenous and not, experience that violence either at the hands of an intimate partner or a family member. And so the intimate partner violence is my own story. And the other reason I share this picture is because there's nothing really striking about it. You wouldn't necessarily know what was happening to me just by looking at this picture. But now, years later, when I look at it, I see really heavy bags under my eyes and I'm tired. My trafficker's head is in the background of the picture because I wasn't ever allowed to be alone. And so there's a different story when you kind of go a little bit deeper. And I share all of this to kind of situate my relationship to the work that we do at Sovereign Bodies Institute, and also to be transparent about why I think survivor leadership is so important, and why issues to address MMIWG2, or missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, have to be led by survivors. And it's because I myself almost was a missing or murdered Indigenous woman. The map that you see on this slide is a map that I created for my master's thesis, which was on using maps to tell Indigenous stories of genocide. And maps became my way of kind of telling my story on my own terms. And sorry if you hear my dogs in the background. Really figuring out how to tell my story in a way that was healing for me, in a way that protected me and protected the men in my life who had abused me, but also gave me the platform to share what I felt was most important and try to make sense of the kind of maze of trauma that I was trying to navigate. And so this map is not only my story, but my story in relation to some of the stories of 3 of the men that abused me at different points in my life, all of which are also Indigenous and all of which are survivors of violence in their own right. And so it was a little more complicated for me. We were all from tribes in Montana living in Washington. And so there was a kind of sense of home living in an urban space and having that sense of kinship. And also there was a shared experience of trauma because all of them had experienced child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault. One of them even experienced trafficking themselves. And so it's part of a broader ripple effect of violence that I was trying to make sense of. And maps were a really healing way for me to do that personally as a survivor. And it kind of inspired the work that we do at Sovereign Bodies Institute. So I'm going to skip through these a little bit and go to this slide here. This is another map for my thesis, and it's what gave birth to Sovereign Bodies Institute. So I was trying to make sense of all the different ways that Indigenous peoples of the US and Canada are made to disappear. And I really wanted to refuse that by making their faces and their stories literally part of the landscape. So that's a little bit of the context of this map. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people is one of the issues on the map, but as you can see, there's quite a few issues on the map. So it wasn't specifically about that. But in order to kind of do the description for that particular issue, I needed a good working number of how many cases had occurred in the US and Canada. And this was 6 years ago. So at that time, there were lots of lists and numbers in Canada, but none of them matched. And there really wasn't any information in the US. And so I was pretty naive in thinking that I could just cross-reference all these lists and news articles and the project would have a start and an end and I could come up with a number. And now 6 years later, this has become my life's work. And it had very humble beginnings. My left hand was still broken from abuse. And I typed the first few hundred entries of the database with that broken hand. It was in a bakery because I couldn't afford Wi-Fi at home. But that's kind of the humble grassroots nature of our work. I did it because I was called to, and I cared for that data and continued to gather it just as a grassroots community member for several years. It wasn't funded, it wasn't tied to any organization. My little sister was our first official intern and we worked together at the kitchen table. Very humble beginnings. But in 2018, when it started getting more press attention and started being used by different Indigenous communities in really exciting ways, we felt that the database needed a more formal home and that it needed a place to live beyond just my kitchen table. And so that's how Sovereign Bodies Institute came to be. So this is a really brief overview of some of the information we track in the database at Sovereign Bodies Institute. And one of the things that I think is most beautiful about the database is that we track whatever the community tells us to track. So it's really reflective of Indigenous expertise and community priorities. We travel throughout Indian country, less so due to COVID, but prior to COVID, sometimes 3 to 4 times a month, sharing the database with different communities. And everywhere we go, people have ideas of, it'd be great if you included this, or have you thought about that? And every time someone has an idea like that, we add it. So we're not only constantly adding additional cases to the data, we're also adding new data points. And so this list kind of gives you some examples of the kind of data we collect. We try to honor the violence that occurred. and also track how law enforcement and the justice system are responding to it or often not responding to it. But we also try to honor the victim for who they were and what they meant to their family. So we track how many children they had, if there's other missing or murdered cases in their families, what their name in their tribal language is, if that's something their family's comfortable sharing. Those are things that the government would not ever collect, but are important to us as we work with families and as we strive for justice, not just for the individual cases, but on this issue as a whole. And that really is also reflective of our priorities at Sovereign Bodies Institute. So we're a nonprofit research center focused on gender and sexual violence against Indigenous peoples. Like the database, we've always worked across colonial borders. So we started out working in the US and Canada, but we've now expanded to build systems of kinship with our relatives throughout Latin America as well. We have a sister collective in Mexico and a project that we support in Peru. So we're always looking to, again, build those systems of kinship. But really our work, whether it's collaborations with tribal nations or with grassroots Indigenous organizers, our work is all about empowering tribal nations and Indigenous communities to be the experts on the violence that we experience. And part of that comes from an experience with data that's really harmful. I think Indigenous peoples globally have experienced the exploitative nature of research. And so for us, we really want to transform research into something that's healing, empowering, or mobilizing, rather than something that's working from a deficit perspective on our peoples or not truly reflective of our communities. So one example is many people have heard the statistic 1 in 3 Native women will be raped in their lifetime. It's very commonly printed in media and circulated in the community, but no one really knows how they came up with that number and who they talked to and what's the story behind it and who was a part of that team. And really that statistic is very outdated. It comes from the federal government and it's really not reflective of the realities of our communities. I have an auntie who always says, well, I want to talk to the other two, because the reality is the violence is much higher than that in our communities. So why would we continue to depend on data that doesn't reflect our experiences, that doesn't include our expertise, and comes from an agency that's actually complicit in the violence by being part of the occupation of our lands and our peoples, and the disempowerment of tribal nations and Indigenous communities to hold perpetrators accountable in meaningful ways. And so SBI tries to provide an alternative to say, hey, if we're going to step away from colonial data systems, we need to create our own. And the database is just one part of that. We do partnerships with tribal nations. We also support individual Indigenous researchers who are doing community-based work. And all of that is with the intent of creating new ways of thinking, new knowledge, or new systems to address violence that our peoples experience, specifically through sovereignty and self-determination, both in research and in practice and in policy. So this slide has a few examples of some of the publications that we've put out in the last 1.5 years or so. All of our publications are free for download on our website. So if you're interested in learning more about individual publications, please be sure to check those out. Let's see, I'm going to skip through some of these maps. I want to highlight the other thing that the other half of our work is services provision. We learned really early on that doing research that's led by survivors and families creates the best research possible, but the research is even better than that when our survivors and our families are well taken care of and their needs are met. So that we try to be as holistic as possible in that process. We don't turn any Indigenous person away. If they are a survivor of violence, or if they're a family member of someone who's missing or murdered, we will always provide support and services to them. We have provided things like help paying and organizing for searches for missing persons, help paying for funerals and memorials, or headstones for somebody. We do case advocacy with law enforcement to make sure that the investigation is happening as it should. We've reviewed death investigations. We've made referrals to attorneys and medical care. We provide emergency financial assistance, teletherapy with Indigenous therapists. We really try to be as holistic as possible, and especially for the families who are struggling with their kind of basic needs. We try to provide as much as possible, whether it's help with rent and bills or groceries. We've done school supplies, we've done Easter baskets and Christmas gifts. We try to be a one-stop shop for them. Those families are typically grandmothers that are caring for their grandkids because the parent is missing or murdered. And those elders are going to need years of support. And so we're there for the long haul. The last thing I'll say about SBI is that our board, our staff, our partners, the majority of us are Indigenous survivors or a family member of someone who's missing or murdered. And we're also guided by a Survivors Leadership Council, which is entirely comprised of Indigenous survivors of trafficking and survival sex work. I'm one of the 9 women on that council, and each and every woman there is incredible and a powerhouse in her community, and a powerhouse in this movement. So I hope that this presentation has given some insight into why survivor leadership and family leadership is so important. We're able to do work that other agencies cannot do. And we're able to do work that even other people in our community may not have the skills or the expertise to do, because we've experienced this violence firsthand. And we know how to take care of our relatives who have experienced it. And we know how to gather this data in a good way that resonates with the community, that's helpful to efforts to preventing and addressing violence, and that's rooted in our own experiences. That's the mission of Sovereign Bodies Institute, and that's what I hope you take away from this presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Well, thank you, Anita, and thank you again for sharing your good work. And in interest of time, please reach out to Anita with your questions. We have a tight agenda today, so thank you again for Anita for being a part of our group here today. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Titus Latapo. He's a founding member of the GEO Indigenous Alliance. He's a champion of the community conservation model in Northern Kenya with over 19 years of experience in community development. He's the director of the community and programs at the Sorara Foundation. In this capacity, Titus has helped develop successful conservation strategies, spearheaded collaboration between the county governments and communities, and played a key role in promoting peace between different ethnic groups in the Samburu and neighboring communities. His work is not only helping create the conditions for sustainable socioeconomic development, but also helping to conserve and protect critically endangered species. So with that, my friend Titus, you have the floor.
Thank you, James. Hello, everybody. As James has indicated, my name is Titus Latapo, and I work for a non-profit organization based in northern part of Kenya that is working to support a long-term paradigm shift designed to catalyze a healthy, resilient environment or landscape for both people and wildlife. Our communities, we are pastoralists, the Samburu community, which is an indigenous community. We keep livestock and we keep moving from one point to another point. But because of land degradation and again, increase in human population, we found that livestock is not maybe reliable alone. So we introduce what we call ecotourism as an alternative, as source of livelihood. And again, to encourage the communities around, or maybe the Samburu community, to share the limited space with wildlife and graze their livestock alongside wildlife. Again, I would like to take this opportunity to thank organizers of this event for allowing me to share a bit of experience as an Indigenous leader on about inclusion of humanitarian action within the Samburu community. The Samburu people or tribe is faced by a lot of challenges that hinders a more inclusive humanitarian response or actions. One of it being a lack of communication, especially communication infrastructure, to allow them to access to critical information that include possibly things like rainfall data, monitoring of locusts that in most cases also affect us, drought occurrence, and if that data could have been available, then the community could have been able to have a better preparedness to deal with the crisis. Again, still as an Indigenous community in the northern part of Kenya, we are still we have a poor public service, given the fact that the previous governments have marginalized the community. So you'll find that the road network, mobile network coverage still are limited, or maybe we still have a very poor road, making it very hard for services to reach to the communities. We still have areas that we call hard to reach areas. And what my organization is doing is to create an opportunity for the communities in those hard to reach areas because they have a huge population to access to better medical services. We have an outreach program, health outreach program that mostly targets or focuses on women and children under 5, because you find that it's very hard for pastoralists or maybe the Samburu community even to take their kids for immunization. So as a foundation, we take that responsibility to ensure that those areas that are considered hard to reach areas, we enable the government and medical personnel to reach out to those people. Again, we still have a challenge on women and youth, and I thank Anita for sharing that touching presentation. Women and youth still in our area faces a lot of discrimination. We still have a bad maybe traditional practices like women mutilation, genital mutilation still being practiced in some part of the area. And what we are doing as an organization and together with the government, we are creating awareness to the community to show them that we have bad practices and we also have good practices that we need maybe to do away with. So when we talk about inclusion on Indigenous people, humanitarian action, I think as organization or maybe humanitarian organization and governments, we need to focus on the challenges the communities faces, or maybe the obstacles that prevent the actions to maybe for the community to be taken. So we need to make sure that we improve communication infrastructure. We also need to recognize and document and use traditional knowledge, especially in areas where that we consider as hard to reach areas. We need to use the knowledge maybe to navigate and reach out to the community. Again, as an organization, we are also working to expose our Indigenous people or the Samburu community to other areas where Indigenous people have, let's say, have better practices to enable them learn from the other communities. So basically, James, that's what I can present, and I will welcome questions later. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you, my friend Titus, for that presentation. Again, in interest of time, I know we've been running through technical difficulties here with Mario. So let's keep moving along here. We do have about 25 more minutes according to my schedule. And so I want to make sure that we get through our presentations here, and hopefully we can get everybody in. So your questions, please keep putting them in the question and answer part of the Zoom. We'll get an answer to you the best way we can, as we go forward with our webinar. So let me introduce Stephanie Carroll and Maui Hudson. Stephanie Carroll is an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. She's worked many years in developing indigenous data sovereignty work. Her work really draws upon the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that reaffirms the rights of indigenous nations to control their data about their lands, people, and resources. Also, I wanted to introduce Maui Hudson. He's also associate professor and director of the Kotahi Research Institute at the University of Waikato from the Maori people, Maori Nation. He also focuses on indigenous data sovereignty and the application of indigenous knowledge to decision-making across a range of contemporary contexts. So we have a recorded video from those folks. So with that, Rick, can you play those videos, please? Video, please. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Maui Hudson tōku ingoa no Aotearoa. Tēnei te mihi kia koutou I tēnei wā. Kia ora everyone. My name is Maui Hudson. I'm a associate professor at the University of Waikato, one of the founding members of Te Manararonga and also the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And it's my pleasure to be able to talk to you today. Apologies for not being able to be there in person, but it's something like 4 o'clock in the morning where I am. So I'll put this pre-record in place instead. I need to make sure that I'll just share my screen so I can share some slides with you and talk about Indigenous data sovereignty and the care principles. So, kia ora koutou. So this talk is about, as I mentioned, Indigenous data sovereignty and the care principles towards a more inclusive humanitarian action. These slides are being done in association with my colleague Stephanie Carroll from the University of Arizona. She's unfortunately able to join us, but just want to acknowledge her as we kind of work through this material. It's also important to acknowledge GEO, the GEO Indigenous Alliance that has put together this event. I think it's really important that there are Indigenous voices that are brought into these spaces, and that we really think about the distinctive voice, the distinctive opportunities, and the distinctive knowledges that they bring to conversations about humanitarianism and humanitarian action. Here's my colleague Stephanie Carroll. She is one of the co-founders of the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network and a co-chair and co-founder of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And just attributing a number of the slides and the material in this presentation to her work. So the idea of Indigenous data sovereignty has been, the concept has been crossing the globe. And there are a number of nation state-based Indigenous-led communities of practice already in existence. Te Manararonga Māori Data Sovereignty Network, as I mentioned, I was one of the co-founders in New Zealand. There's the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, which Stephanie Carroll was a co-founder of. The Maya Nairi Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective in Australia. And then nascent and emerging networks in Canada for the First Nations and Métis, and in Sweden with the Sami, and also with colleagues in Mexico. Alongside that, the International Network of Networks, which has come about in the establishment of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, GIDA, but also across other other networks, including the Research Data Alliance, which has hosted an international Indigenous data sovereignties interest group for a number of years now. And that was the place where the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance emerged from. But thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty and how it's come about, you can see here, this is the seminal publication on the topic, which was released in 2016, edited by Tahu Kukutai, or Professor Tahu Kukutai from here in New Zealand, and Professor John Taylor from Australia. But data sovereignty itself is a cloud computing term, which states that data is subject to the laws of the nation within which it's stored. But Indigenous data sovereignty advocates have really taken that idea and flipped it on its head and said that data should be subject to the laws of the nation from which it's collected. So if you're collecting data from an Indigenous nation, it should be subject to the laws of that Indigenous nation or that tribal nation. And the ideas around Indigenous data sovereignty as a discourse, and particularly as a discourse about the rights and interests that Indigenous communities have within data, emerge from a range of places, including ideas around Indigenous or treaty rights, cultural intellectual property rights, Indigenous research ethics, and data ethics. And so these things all help to inform the way people have framed kind of the fundamental underpinnings of Indigenous data sovereignty. But the two areas which we tend to talk about the most is one is it's about data for governance. So ensuring that we can gain access to use data to transform the lives of our people, and also the governance of data. So as data is made available, that we can, and others are able to access that data, that we can manage access to that data to ensure use is relevant and responsive. And you see here the publication on the right-hand side, Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy, is something that has just been released last year. And so with the, I guess the emergence of these ideas and these networks around Indigenous data sovereignty, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance was formed as an international network advancing Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. Really focused on asserting Indigenous people's rights and interest in data and advocating for data that really supports the self-determined well-being of Indigenous peoples and reinforces the rights to engage in decision-making in accordance with Indigenous values and collective interests. And so this idea of promoting Indigenous control of Indigenous data is important, particularly in the context of understanding how data is used to prioritize the allocation of resources, increasingly is used to determine what sorts of activities or initiatives get supported, and what ones are being prioritized across a broader spectrum of society. And so the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance emerged from a workshop which was held in Botswana in 2018 as part of the International Data Week. You can see a picture there with some of the people that were in attendance. And this was supported by the Research Data Alliance and their International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group. CARE itself is an acronym for the principles which were seen to be underpinning or present across a number of Indigenous communities. One there around collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And so you'll see each of those four principles have sub-principles. So collective benefit relates to inclusive development and innovation, for improved governance and citizen engagement, and for equitable outcomes. Authority to control, recognizing rights and interests, data for governance, and governance of data. Responsibility for positive relationships, for expanding capability and capacity, and for Indigenous languages and worldviews, and ethics for minimizing harm and maximizing benefit, for justice and for future use. And so each of the, the care principles have these sub-principles, but also have this descriptions as it relates to each of the primary principles. So for collective benefit, data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from the data. Authority to control Indigenous peoples' rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized, and the authority to control such data be empowered. Indigenous data governance enables Indigenous peoples and governing bodies to determine how Indigenous peoples, as well as Indigenous lands, territories, resources, knowledges, and geographical indicators are represented and identified within data. Responsibility. Those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. Accountability requires meaningful and openly available evidence to these efforts and the benefits occurring to Indigenous peoples. Ethics. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. And so since the establishment of these principles in 2000, or the development in 2018, the launching in 2019, they've subsequently been translated into Spanish, and you'll see here they're known as the CREA principles, and also into Vietnamese. So that's been a part of our activities of engagement across our broader networks, and starting to ensure that the ideas which people gravitate to in the context of the care principles can be reflected across different nations and different language groups. Similarly, the transition of the guidelines from that sort of the state as it was released into policy documents has started as well. So these are the IATSIS, or Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, IATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research. This was recently re-released, and you'll note in the diagram in the top right-hand corner where it talks about Indigenous leadership, it refers to Indigenous-led research, Indigenous perspectives and participation, and Indigenous knowledge and data. And in the section on Indigenous knowledge and data, you'll see that it's talking about institutions with responsibilities for data access and use policies or design and management of data ecosystems should adopt Indigenous data sovereignty and governance principles. And in that instance, researchers should be aware of and apply international data principles of FAIR. People might be familiar with the FAIR principles and how they relate to open data, and CARE, the CARE principles as we just described for Indigenous data governance. And so reflecting on ideas around Indigenous data sovereignty or Indigenous control of Indigenous data, and the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, and what they might mean in the context of humanitarian networks and partnerships. And in particular, this focused on inclusion. And so inclusion as impartiality, and really the need for disaggregated data for inclusive humanitarian responses. Here in New Zealand, when tribes have said that they don't understand how the data that's collected at an ethnic basis refers to them specifically. And there's a comment of, I don't know who those people are, but when you start talking about my tribe, then I know who those people are and I know how to act. Inclusion is equitable access, the need to close the digital divide to ensure that all Indigenous communities have access to critical EO data. Really thinking about that in the context of my community, the Whakatohia Nation, where we've put in place a Digital Natives Academy for our youth to try and build those skills, build that capacity so that we're in a position to engage not only with the digital economy, but be able to speak back in ways, speak back to people that might use data in ways that are disadvantageous to us. And inclusion is participation. So how EO data and tools can ensure that Indigenous communities can have equal access by allowing them to participate in humanitarian responses with evidence-based data. And in the same context, our community has been associated with developing its own kind of database system so that we can collect information ourselves, and we can use that alongside the things that other agencies are doing to provide a better outcome for our people, but also in our engagement with those agencies to talk about how they might better allocate resources towards the needs which we have. And so hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea about Indigenous data sovereignty and the key principles for Indigenous data governance. Certainly we're always interested in advocating for Indigenous control of Indigenous data, not just for the control of it itself, but that the control of the data contributes to the control of the narrative. And that if we then can control the narrative, then we can ensure that we can contribute to the expression of Indigenous aspirations. Reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Well, thank you, Stephanie and Mari, for that presentation on data sovereignty. We appreciate it. And please, if you have any questions again for Mari and for Stephanie on their presentation, please put it in the question and answer, and we'll make sure that we get an answer to you. You know, with our technology's troubles, we're going to try to go back to Mario.
Yes.
Mario, Mario, you're next. Take it away.
Okay.
Oh.
Hello.
Try to speak, Mario.
¿Me escuchan?
Yes, try. Di una frase completa.
Hello, Mario.
Sí.
How are you?
How are you?
Good.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I'm okay.
Titus, can you put on mute, please? Okay, adelante, Mario.
Hello, my name is Mario Vargas Chacen. Today I will talk to you a little bit about why technology is important for humanitarian action. Next. I am the technical officer of the All Ace on the Amazon project at Taiga. Taiga is the coordinator of indigenous organization in the Amazon basin. It coordinates 9 national Amazonian indigenous organizations and represents the interests of indigenous people at an international level. Net. The Amazon is home to many indigenous people and nationalities, and people in voluntary isolation distributed in thousands of communities. We are the ones who play a fundamental role in the conservation of socio-environmental services that the Amazon provides to the planet. Net. Modern technology in our territories is still a distant dream. Many of the communities do not have internet and energy service. The knowledge of our people on conservation has helped the population to survey for thousands of years. Next. The remote communities of the Equatorial Amazon need to be supported, which the implementation of internet and energy, so that we can contribute to the scientific community, which the knowledge on our ancestors on how to care for the environment. Since we are living the strong impacts of climate change and COVID in our territories and cannot move the people to the city. So we are living the aftermath of the pandemic of COVID. Net in the Equatorial Amazon, we are training young indigenous people in the use of new technologies, such as the use of drones, GPS maps, but we need a look of support. Next. The aim is to collect information on the impacts that we are living in our territories due to the impacts of climate change. We ask for supporting from the scientific community to help us access the data of the air to speak our ways of life. Next. I call on the international community to support the indigenous community since we have been protecting the forest for thousands of years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mario, for your presentation again, and for the great work and good work that you're doing down there in the
You're
Amazon
welcome.
with your people. And so as we wind down here, folks, we want to, so you have questions, answers, please put it in the Q&A. We'll make sure that the presenters will get them and an opportunity for them to respond back to you. And so we look forward to that. As we get ready, we want to introduce one of our good partners here and our friends from the group on Earth observations. That person is Stephen Ramage. Stephen is the head of the international relations for GEO. He works on the use of Earth observations to support things like the Paris Agreement and United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development. So we're happy to have Stephen with us. Stephen, the floor is yours, my friend.
Hi, thanks, James. And thanks to everyone. I wish there were 5,000 people on this call and not just 50 of us. So inclusion is essential. And I'm just going to quickly run through some of the things that we've heard the speakers say. Anders talked about the reindeer's herder's life, notably how latest technologies have been integrated and must be combined with Indigenous knowledge. He also highlighted extreme weather events, intensity of Arctic fires, impact on snow and ice, and how remote sensing can be used to better predict and understand changes. There is a shared vision for the internet in every tent, and again, satellites help. For Titus, he talked about a resilient landscape for people and wildlife, about many hard to reach areas, and their outreach program, which is helping women and children under 5. And he also reiterated the use of Indigenous knowledge. I know that geography and Earth observations play a role in supporting the pastoralists and the Samburu tribe. Anita spoke about, it was an incredibly powerful and personal story about human trafficking. She talked about Indigenous survivor-led research and using maps to tell Indigenous stories. And for me, she really highlighted these shared experiences of trauma. So please check out Sovereign Bodies Institute. Mario, who we just heard, he talked about COICA as the coordinator of the Indigenous organizations in the Amazon region, how they're representing the voices of millions of people. And really, at the end, he made a call for international support to effectively continue protecting the forest. Then, just before that, we heard Maui Hudson and Stephanie Carroll on their joint presentation with Maui speaking. And I think what Maui said was, you know, there are distinctive voices, distinctive opportunities, and distinctive messages for the humanitarian community. And this talk outlines some extensive activities already underway globally on Indigenous data sovereignty, a really important point for the humanitarian community as well. Explaining the difference between where the data is stored, i.e. the nation, versus how the data is collected and by whom. So there are many useful papers and topics on this, many useful papers and books on this topic. And you can also refer to the CARE principles for Indigenous data sovereignty. So I think that was something very much. So just to summarize, I think this is an amazing global community with important stories to share. They are, you know, we're supporting underrepresented or unheard people. So as I said right at the beginning, inclusion is essential. So please contact any of the co-founders of the GEO Indigenous Alliance and come and work with us. Thank you, James.
No, thank you, Stephen. Again, appreciate your support and your good thoughts. You know, as a moderator, sometimes I kind of jump ahead a little bit just to respect everybody's time. And it turns out that we have a little more time before we wrap up with one of our elder closings. So we have something called open discussion. So again, I apologize for jumping ahead of open discussion, but, you know, we welcome those here are with us, the 40 participants or so that are here with us. You know, please give us your thoughts and comments and questions. We have a little bit more time today, so we welcome that. So the floor is open to our participants. If you don't ask anything, I'm going to start talking. You don't want that.
James, I think there's some questions in the Q&A from.
Okay. All right. Yeah, this is a question from Angelica Gutierrez, and she's the chair of the Mary GEO, and maybe this is for all our participants. So maybe you guys can unmute yourself. So question number one is, one of our most significant problems in science and the application of satellite observation is the lack of in situ data. When listening to the various presentations, including those with social data, activities such as citizen monitoring come to mind. Are any of your communities formally participating in situ monitoring, water, air, social data, and economic data? So that's question number one. So the floor is open to respond to that question from Angelica Gutierrez. Thank you, Angelica, for that question. It's a good question. Mario has his hand up. Mario, the floor is yours.
James, he had his hand up from before.
Oh, okay. All right, put your hand down, Mario.
Titus, maybe you would like to talk about the project in your community about in situ data management.
Yeah, I think maybe if I can respond, we have let's say use of GPS especially the monitoring of livestock movement on the spot, so that maybe we'll be able to advise the community on areas where lions or maybe predators are. So we normally use let's say satellite images sometimes on collars that are on lions or even elephants, so that communities can avoid a human wildlife conflict, and we report directly to the community.
Okay. Thank you, Titus. We have another question here from Christina Russo. How can Indigenous communities collaborate with the corporate industry for resource optimization and likelihood recovery? Hello?
James, maybe that question is for you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I think what I've sort of heard today, and so the work that I do and support through the GEO Indigenous Alliance is the word partnerships again. I really think that when we think about this issue of corporations and things, I really do think that that there has to be first and foremost understanding of how UNDRIP works, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. I think those principles are important in terms of any kind of beginning of engagement with private sector. Also, I think that there's a role for training. There's a role for capacity building with organizations that want to work with Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures. And finally, I would say that, I think there's a need for something that I call ethical space, or it's been called ethical space, where, when you bring two worldviews together, organizations together that are different, is how do those organizations come together to understand each other, let alone work together? And I think that in a third space, for instance, is where you may find opportunities to work together. But again, I always go back to sort of history, and I think we all have to understand that there's been a pattern, and some people would say continuing a pattern for exploitation of Indigenous people and resources. So I think that there is this movement around the globe to decolonize these partnerships. So I would say for our meeting today, it's important that we think about, again, the work that's been done to decolonize these partnerships, decolonize the process. And finally, I think to re-indigenize or to indigenize solutions that would meet the needs of our people. So that's an answer. Okay. Another question, well, again, was Angelica. For our Latin American folks, it says accurate social data from Indigenous communities don't exist because the majority of countries, tribal laws bind the reporting mechanism. For example, 30 women, but no age level of education, etc. This practice is affecting the services that the communities receive from central government. Is this a practice unique to Latin America? Anybody want to respond to that question from the Latin America context? Anita?
Sure, I can speak to it a little bit, because it sounds like the question is about if those practices are just in Latin America or elsewhere as well. And I'll say that in our work in Latin America, we certainly see that, but we also see that really commonly in the US and Canada as well. There's I think colonial data systems in general don't really have the capability of accurately collecting and maintaining data on Indigenous peoples, because they're so out of touch with the realities of our communities and our life ways and our ways of thinking and ways of relating to one another. And we see that in data on crime all the time. And really, there's no way of getting around that short of training every single, law enforcement, medical examiner, everybody you could possibly think of. And even with all of the great training in the world, you still have to hope they actually learn something and implement it. So really, that's not a viable solution. And the way forward is for Indigenous peoples to govern their own data.
Okay, thank you, Anita. Well, folks, to honor your time and and this thankful for your participation today, I want to turn it over to Titus to close our session today. And so I also want to thank you from a personal perspective that I appreciate your time today, your interest in these topics. These are big topics. These are important topics, and we hope that you will continue to engage with the GEO Indigenous Alliance. As we move this work forward, we'll continue to bring awareness to these issues, continue to bring people together like this, and continue to build those good partnerships that are needed to advance the work. So with that, I want to ask Titus if he would introduce the elder to close our session today. Titus.
Thank you, James. In fact, you are a very, very good moderator, and well done, and keep up the good work. And thanks everybody for your participation. Thanks, Diana, for organizing this. I will then maybe ask Diana to put the video of the elder on. Ripo is an elder from Samburu, and is a key elder. Currently, they are out on dry zone grazing areas. He was not able to be with me, and he's going to lead us with a word of prayer, praying for livestock, praying for rain, praying for good time, and praying for the indigenous people across the world. Kindly put the video on.
Paragwini, Paralgiri, Berigito, Nandapan, Garasal, Deolokop, Tirugo, Paragwini, Durabelo, Telugumi, Landapan, Garasal, Deolokop, Naibor, Norok, Andum, Nabagishun, Namana, Manigishu, Rolinyo, Woki, Deolokop, Marsabit, Ungiro, Lolorogi, Kuyelibor, Olonyegi, Andaman, Nabasimu, Yabarra, Yandaban, Urasa, Yolokop, Dana, Robik, Ramayana, Limuru, Eburigi, Yanabo, Amayan, Namaidak, Amayan, Anadil, Gaina, Yogi, Ridala, Jona, Garainin, Yandaban, Urasa, Yindelu, Yongai, Jona, Yomada, Peredu, Medibugo, Nandu, Nadi, Basambu, Yamaniki, Rugoro, Molly, Yeshami, Izugu, Andibi, Danyada, Ulirigan, Yuinini, Nevada, Ulubi, Rondodo, Erara, Irimi, Hidribo, Emonga, Nangurun, Nasanga, Yadada, Nandaban, Gorasar, Nuangama, Yolokop, Ishuna, Narok, Naibar, Masola, Izigiju, Yavare, Rimisi, Lugumai, Orobiju, Lugumai, Orobiju, Rimisi, Pangeli, Esola, Erachai, Nandugun, Devi, Eshangai, Jumugi, Dirisodo, Anana, Lugumuji, Rankai, Shamayo, Bainoro, Jusian, Adanaba, Angayai, Laramada, Domanok, Laramada, Domanok.
We want to thank the Samburu elder, and thank you, Titus, for the introduction again. Thank you for participating in our session today. Again, we welcome your thoughts, your comments, and your partnership. So with that, as moderator, James Rowling, let's sign off, and wishing you a good day, good evening, and we'll see you soon. We'll be Latanka Chichapalo, Midakuya Oyasi, all my relations.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.